Welcome back, friends, to You're Listening to Radio Revel in the series Fictional Interlude. This week we're listening to the second part of the story titled When Herb Met Mable. Hope you enjoy it. Mable had to control herself a little as she set the telephone receiver in its cradle. That call was going to make her next 5 days some of the happiest and longest in her life. That call would change her way of looking at the shopping, the making of the beds, the afternoon soap operas, dinner time, lunchtime, breakfast. It would help her understand that it wasn't really so bad living with H under the roof, with the strange atmosphere of unreality his disjointed memories spread in the household. This evening's unusual reference to her period of courting had finally thrown her off track, had left her pondering over times that, since the birth of her son, she rarely pondered over. Those were difficult times for Mable, doubtful times, when the decision to marry that man she had met in Susie's home-cooking cafe had to be weighed against an earlier decision made to care for her aging father. That decision came directly from a streak of pride she had inherited from him. H had been such a strong, useful man, and Mable could not allow anyone to see how his accident had left him such a weak, useless man. She had made the decision too young, had misread the symptoms of H's psychological distress. She was only 17 years old. Her mother recently passed on, her 7 brothers and sisters, all younger than she, also calling out for care. The accident had shocked them all, despite its inevitability. H liked working on cars. It was a kind of passionate hobby. Since boyhood he had had permanently stained fingernails, which he kept long to help pick up small objects, serve as a type of tweezers, and to pick at his nose, which he was quite fond of doing. He often equated picking his nose with being as satisfying as a good bowel movement. H had always been a vulgar man. His fame in the community as an auto wizard grew and was maintained by his generosity. H was always on 24-hour call for any friend or neighbor or family who suddenly found themselves without means of transportation. Sometimes the problem was as simple as an empty gas tank. Once it was as grave as the crank box cracking open. H loved working with cars so much that besides the parts he never charged for his work. He was a very popular man, and until 1949 kept the small town nearby free from a mechanic's shop. When H made a repair, he did it right, never received a request to repair something on any vehicle that he had once repaired. When his wife died in childbirth with the 8th, when he found himself having to put the youngest 5 in foster homes, he felt his passion for cars had been siphoned off until his tank was empty. He began to drop wrenches on his feet and find spare bolts and nuts and washers left over when he finished a repair. A neighbor hiked over to H's place complaining that his truck wouldn't start up, was so goddamn cold and the battery seemed to have died. This was the first time that H had felt like bitching about his reputation as an automotive good Samaritan, and it would be the last. Because it was the first, he kept his harsh words to himself because he had not yet acquired the habit, and as it was his last, he would fortunately never acquire the habit. He pulled on his overcoat, trudged out to his truck through ankle-deep snow, checking in the back to make sure that the jumper cables were wound up around the saddle horn he had installed himself as a reminder of his childhood days when the family had been carted about by a pair of beautiful gray horses. He drove with the neighbors silently and parked so that the 2 trucks, his and the disabled, were fender to fender, like 2 friends about to kiss hellos on the cheeks. He opened the hood of the other truck first, opened the cap on the cell chambers, and muttered a few blue words under his breath at the stupidity of a man with a vehicle to let the cells dry out. He sent the neighbor, who was fat and greasy and more than just a little slow, into the house to look for some water, while he unrolled the jumper cables and opened the hood of his own truck and attached the cables to his battery. It was freakish for Mabel to see her father in the cold turn-of-the-decade hospital with his face nearly totally bandaged, only the mouth and chin left free. He would be blind, there was no doubt about that. There was little, if anything, left of his eyes. Worse than the wounds, though, the doctors would tell her, was his attitude. He had decided that the loss of his sight meant the loss of his life. No one, not even his late wife, knew what it was exactly H did to make a living, but it was evident that he wouldn't be able to make that living without his vision. He had been forced to retire at the age of 52 into uselessness, a character of pity and charity. This, of course, changed his daughter's outlook on life considerably. Someone had to bring money into the house. As the oldest, the responsibility fell upon her all too young shoulders. She wanted to quit school, but her teachers wisely advised her to finish her last year. She would be more valuable to the family as an educated person than as a dropout. The insurance policies and government funds would help make ends meet until she found a good job. She decided to follow this advice, though it would mean sending the two remaining sisters at home to foster homes as well. This cleft in the family felt almost normal since the death of Mabel's mother. Practicality always superseded family togetherness in times of crisis. Mabel studied typing and shorthand and adding machine manipulation, skills that would be useful for the single woman with the blind father to support in the male-dominated working world. At her graduation, she wondered why she had bothered, as a sympathetic teacher whose sister-in-law worked for the phone company had arranged for her to begin working as a hello girl the week after having received her diploma, a job that did not employ a typewriter, a pen and pad, nor a calculating machine. The main thing she disliked about her work was the headset, which was bulky and heavy and uncomfortable. She often thought about how it could be made better, but her ignorance of such things as how telephones actually worked held her back from designing a more practical tool for her work. So she, always trying to look on the bright side of things, focused more on the pleasure she got out of the service she was able to provide. Mabel didn't care for telephones herself. They made such a racket when they rang. She always ran to catch the one at home before it had the chance to ring twice. In fact, her friends knew that if the phone rang twice or thrice, that she was probably out. And it always seemed to ring when she was in the middle of something, and the more important that something was, the longer the caller kept her on the line. She believed that the caller had the responsibility of ending the call. She could never tell this long-winded friend or that talkative relative that the cookies were burning in the oven, or that she had to use the toilet. Many times she found herself with that hard, cold receiver pressed against her ear to the point of earache for up to an hour. Her mind would begin to wander. Her would become less frequent, and the caller would invariably be put off and abruptly end the conversation or monologue, but would not be put off enough to not repeat the ritual the following day or the day after or the next week. Some days she felt as if she took as many calls at home as at work. She was well liked. The courtship was quite short according to the standards of the mid-50s community they lived in. Mabel vaguely remembered having seen Herb during her school days. He was a couple years older than she, was a baseball jock, always seemed to have a new girlfriend on his arm or around his neck. He had a car, which at first she admired in him, since it vaguely represented that he was someone going somewhere. But immediately after her mother's death and in the year Herb graduated, she turned her mind from boys because of her responsibilities in the house. When they finally met that spring of 54, she had little idea how rapidly she would not only fall in love with him, but see him as a type of savior, someone who might join her in improving her lot, someone to rescue her from having to ignore the ever-increasing temperatures of her personal hell. She smiled back as Herb returned from the payphone with a grin that spread so wide she thought the top of his head might fall off. As he sat again, he said, "Well, now, you asked me what I did, wasn't that it? I work for Harley Construction. I'm one of their interior carpenters." Instead of saying, "That's nice," or "How interesting," Mabel glanced at her watch and said, with a slight hint of dismay and disappointment in her voice, I'm so sorry, Herb, but I really must get back to work. I'm on the very verge of being late. Herb did not so successfully hide the dismay in his voice as he asked her where she worked. Her answer made him smile. I knew I'd heard your voice somewhere. Do you think I might give you a call sometime? Well, I don't know. Don't you worry, Mabel. I won't ask you for your phone number. I already know it. Oh, you do you? Sure. All I have to do is dial O. I can't talk while I'm on duty. You can't talk, but I can. You'd better run along to work now before you're late. Who was that on the phone just now? H's sudden question broke through the happy bubble Mabel had inflated about herself since setting down the phone. She was thinking about preparing chocolate cake the day after next, and the thought strangely had led her to think about a day when she arrived late to work. It was highly uncommon for her, and besides the guilt she felt for falling short on her responsibilities, there was the high-strung temper of her supervisor, Shirley, to deal with. Whenever any one of the girls was ill or late, Shirley would have to fill in for her, and that was something Shirley literally despised doing. Shirley opined that having to connect cables and deal with the public was below her station. Mabel was instantly terrorized when she entered the switchboard room and saw Shirley sitting in her seat, the full 25 pounds of the headset making her look like an airplane pilot, forcing her head to shrink into her shoulders, making her fat, short neck seem shorter and fatter. Shirley's back was to the door as Mabel entered, and she was violently plugging and unplugging cables into the switchboard. For a moment it seemed like there was smoke coming out of her ears from under the headsets, but then Mabel watched as Shirley pulled a cigarette out of her mouth and threw it to the floor, stamping it out with the oversized ball of her oversized foot she had squeezed into a number 7 black spike heel shoe. Shirley did not hear Mabel come up behind her and gave an exaggerated gasp of shock when she felt Mabel's hand touch her shoulder. "One moment, please," she said to the caller on the line. She removed the headpiece and thrust it towards Mabel. "Where in the hell have you been, girl? One more minute of this bullshit and you would have found your ass out on the street. Jesus Christ. You get a full goddamn hour for lunch. What the hell do you mean coming in 5 minutes late? You know goddamn well how these lines get right after lunch hour break. Christ. If this happens again, I'll have to dock you a full hour of pay. You know I'm authorized to do so." "Aren't you listening to me, girl?" "What's that, Daddy?" "I asked you who the hell telephoned. Good goddamn holy shit. You going deaf or something?" "No, Daddy, I'm not going deaf." "Where's that no-good husband of yours? I'll ask him." "Herb's upstairs asleep, Dad, so please try to keep your voice down." "Have to shout around here to get anyone to listen to you. This place is a shittin' loony bin." "Oh, you're right there, Dad. Now, Daddy, calm down, and I'll bring you a cup of coffee and tell you who that was who telephoned." "You're damned right you'll get me a cup of coffee and tell me who it was. Shittin' bug farm, that's what this place is. I'm the only one around here with half a brain left." But now Mabel could not hear her father's ravings, in part because they were taking on a familiar tone that she no longer heard, like folk living beside the expressway, not noticing the sound of constantly passing traffic, and in part because she had left him alone in the living room and had gone to the kitchen, which was at the other side of the house. She felt safe there, knowing that her father's sensory perception could not penetrate a kind of magical force field she had set up around the room. She never allowed him in her kitchen. Herb hardly went into the room except for an occasional late-night glass of warm milk, and he was always careful to leave the room exactly as he had entered it. The kitchen was Mabel's retreat, and both the men knew so. It was in this room that she could organize her thoughts, or disorganize them, or simply have bad thoughts without feeling guilty about them. It was in this room where she had nourished her only child, her oldest and youngest, Pierce. Here she had prepared and served so many roasts with carrots and potatoes, so many lasagnas, so many deviled eggs and potato salads, and so many chocolate cakes, put on the table before her small family, her husband, her father, her son. She loved the company of the men in her life, cried when the oldest youngest didn't come home for Thanksgiving one year, followed by a string of Thanksgivings, the one Christmas without the need to buy gifts for the son, followed by a string of Christmases. Then Pierce moved out east and embroiled himself in so many obligations that he never could seem to find time to head back to the Midwest to visit. She and Herb had put H in a care home twice to be able to drive out to see her son. She did not think it was so, but sometimes wondered if Pierce was avoiding them with his move to Europe. He must have known that they would be unable to drive across the ocean. Herb didn't care for flying, she would not travel alone, and Pierce would not come back to the States with any regularity, because now he had even more distance between himself and his. She did not blame him entirely, as it was clear during his childhood that living under this roof was not a simple task. She had tried to make her home comfortable. She and her husband were a nearly ideal couple, as they loved one another, even yet like newlyweds, even yet recalling their meeting at Susie's. The problem had been twofold, each of the pleats being the other two men in the house. Her father had gone somewhat mad when Pierce was born, the tense scenes sometimes lasting for days. "Slut!" H screamed from his chair by the heater. "Worthless hussy, is this what your mother would want of you? She must be turning somersaults in her grave knowing that her oldest daughter is out screwing any goddamn man in the county, and now you bring your bastard son home and expect me to accept him as if he were my grandson? No goddamn grandson of mine. Let me tell you, you can take him straight to the Sisters of Charity, because I won't see any bastard raised under my roof." "Daddy, this is not your roof. It's mine and Herb's roof." Mable was transported to the roof of the first house that she and Herb had built back in '57. The mad ranting of her father had only lasted as long as they lived indeed under his roof. Mable could only call it her and Herb's because it was clear that they would have to live for some years in H's house, and they had picked up the mortgage payments once they were married. They were in the end only 3 years of scrupulously scrimping and saving, and careful planning. The birth of Pierce had postponed their plans a full year. Herb, at 26, knew a great deal about house construction from having helped his father build his family home and all of the outbuildings that made up their small farm. Despite this useful experience that marked his years in the Marines with an aptitude towards being a handyman, a jack of all trades, and his new work in interior construction, Herb was only hard-working, not very imaginative. They were sitting on the roof, or rather what was to be the roof, Mable and her sister Fanny, asking one another just what they thought they were doing. What they were doing was following Herb's oblique instructions about how they were to be laying and nailing down the roofing shingles, and Mable, though she wanted to have total confidence in her husband, had begun to doubt his expertise in certain areas of house building, since only a week earlier they had had to re-pour the cement foundation. The cost of new cement and all put them another month behind in living under their own roof. Now placing tar tiles on that roof, after having painted the edges with gooey tar paste, then nailing them down against high winds, Mable tried hard to think if this might be the way things were done. It did seem logical to begin at the eaves and work one's way towards the peak, but she couldn't help wondering if it were possible that they should be doing it the other way around. Her son, Pierce, sat in his carriage, nearly oblivious to the activity and noise that surrounded him. It was now 2 years since Mable had hung up her headset and converted herself into a regular housewife. It was unthinkable that she would work while their son was growing up. Growing up was enough work for one person that he would need help, and her help turned into a full-time occupation. With this change in their economic structure, Mable found herself not only tending to their child, but also to his father as well as her own. Mabel's life now revolved around dust on shelves, clean bed linen, washing dishes so that they could dirty them 3 times a day, daily laundry, and daily hanging it on the high lines, high by her request so that she would have an excuse to stretch her back after bending over the wash tub before they could afford to buy an automatic washer. Pierce was a full 5 years old before he was presented with the modern reality of indoor plumbing. An outhouse had been erected on her father's place a generation earlier, 2 holes for the adults. When would there ever be 2 adults sitting next to one another in the necessary? And a third lower and smaller hole for the children. Mabel and Herb had planned a new modern bathroom for the new house, but were forced to put off the final installation because the cess tank had to be approved, then constructed. The fixtures were dear, as well as the pump they needed to build up water pressure. Because of these delays, they put up a new outhouse and put a pathway of stones between the back door and the privy, which Mabel later surrounded with beds of marigolds to keep the flies away. Pierce had been slow in potty training because he didn't like the idea of having to spend any time in that house out back. He imagined spiders and rats crawling out of the holes and biting his pink butt, wet the bed during nightmares, but never let on just what his feelings were to his parents because he thought that they thought him to be a brave boy. Later, when the outhouse was scrubbed up with bleach and painted white and planted at the end of the mile-long lane that separated their house from the main road where it was meant to serve as a shelter for Pierce while waiting for the school bus on freezing winter mornings, the boy would still not enter, and instead stood on one side or the other to shield himself from the winds. This project of building a house was almost too big for the 2 people who had decided to undertake it. The land was theirs, or Herb's at least, a small tract that Herb's father had cultivated with strawberries and carnations, with remarkable success because there were no trees around. The soil was moist and black and rich, and the water table was high. There was an old well his father had dug only 15 feet deep that yet gave water. Mabel had never been able to get anything to grow besides strawberries and flowers in her many gardens. Even grass and weeds could not put down roots. She did manage to get a couple of apple trees planted, but didn't know they would not live in the house long enough to benefit from their shade. They should have known from the beginning when the basement collapsed that the house itself was somewhat cursed. They had finally gotten a large hole dug, work that took over a month because besides removing dirt, they had to constantly remove water as well. Not having a pump or an excavating machine, both the earth and water were hefted out in pails. Despite Herb's nearly angry insistence in the size and depth of the cellar, after 4 weeks of afternoon and weekend excavating, Mabel was able to convince him that they could stop where they were, just a little over halfway dug. Plans made could be changed. They called a friend who had a cement mixer, made plans for the next weekend, and in 2 days, after a week of rest from the month's back-breaking lifting and dumping and refilling buckets, they were able to pour the 4 walls and floor of the basement, step back from the edge of the lined hole they had made, and congratulate themselves on the work accomplished. The following week they dedicated to putting up the basic 2x4 structure. The size of the basement, now half that which had been expected, had little influence on the size of the house, much of which had been expected to sit on block foundations with only a small crawl space underneath to insulate the 3 back bedrooms from the cold earth. The area over the basement was dedicated to the kitchen and future bath. Between was a small sitting dining area. After putting up the outside wall frames and laying the floor joists, they had planned on spending the next weekend laying the floor boards and preparing for closing off the roof. Saturday morning, they drove out to the house, and on the way, Mabel suggested to Herb that they would have to gravel the lane because even after such little rain as that they had had Friday night, the car skidded easily on the greasy black surface that had only served horses and tractors in the past. They parked in front of the door, which Herb had secretly hung in its frame to surprise Mabel as a symbolic gesture of the portal through which he planned on carrying his wife into their first home, totally theirs. Only Herb noticed at first that the door was not there. Mabel noticed first that the entire front wall was missing, and that the 2 side walls were definitely not standing at right angles with the ground. Together they got out of the car, and smashing the first young strawberries under their shoes, they discovered that the entire front wall of the recently poured cellar had totally collapsed into what now appeared to be a large, dirty swimming pool. They looked at each other without making any comment, got back into the car, and drove to Susie's home cooking cafe, where they each had a cup of coffee and a piece of chocolate cake. That's it for this installment of When Herb Met Mabel here on You're Listening to Radio Revel. There's one more part to finish off the story, and that will be available to you all next week. Cheers!
You're listening to Radio Revel. Listen, like, subscribe, and share.